going to start a new series today. I had given some thought to taking the series that we started this year and making it a very long series. And I decided somewhere along the way here to kind of shift gears and us to move away from that and to take on a new theme for the month of February. And so this series is a little bit down home, and at least its title, because I've titled it, It Ain't Over Yet. It Ain't Over Yet. And you say, what's not over yet? Well, maybe you can answer that question. What is it that you have kind of wondered if is over? Maybe God wants to say to you, that's not over. One of the things that I know to be true, and that is, as long as we're living and breathing, it ain't over yet. And God has a purpose, and He has a plan for our lives. And sometimes we get very confused about, why are we here? What are we here for? What are we about? And I have known, my great-grandfather lived to be 96. My grandfather lived to be 100. And they, I think particularly my grandfather that lived to be 100 probably asked the question a few times, why am I still here? He was in reasonably good health, even up to, but I think his usefulness, he felt like his usefulness was not there. But I can tell you, one of the things that he did do was he prayed consistently for his family, and it was always fun to be around him. And so sometimes we're a blessing when we don't know we're a blessing. We wonder, well, what am I here for? And the truth of the matter is, God has a purpose for you. You wouldn't be here if He didn't have a purpose for you. You're here because He has a purpose. So, and today we're going to particularly talk about when a setback is a setup. When a setback is a setup. I don't know, has anybody in here ever had a setback? Can I just see your hand? If you've ever had a setback. Okay, thank you. My suspicion is that everybody, I saw Evangie had both hands up, so I just hope I wasn't one of the setbacks there. But anyway, most of us have had a setback or two or three along the way. Some of them not as serious as others, but and it happens, financially for people, happens relationally for people, it happens, career-wise for people. There's a lot of ways that we can have setbacks, and unfortunately, most of us don't escape life without some. So, what do we do with those, and how do we look at those, and how do we handle those, and how do we process that, and what can we see that God might do in our lives through that? Our memory verse today is a great verse from James chapter 1, and it says this. Blessed is the one who receives, or who perseveres. Let's start that over again. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love Him. And I don't believe God's point of view is that we just survive. Let's just survive. But there are days whenever it is a victory to have survived the day, and there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that you hung in there. You just didn't quit. You persevered. And so you don't want every day to feel like you're hanging on by your fingertips. But there are some days when that is the case. And when that is the case, that's a good thing to do, to hang on just to what you do have, the hope that you do have, the truth that you do have, the strength that you do have. You hold on. And so I'm going to use an example from the Old Testament. Some of our teenagers in here I've referred to this scripture actually just recently. In fact, we're in a series right now, youth, on Joseph. And that's not why I'm using him here today, because I'm using it from a different angle, different focus. But I feel like his story really conveys to us a lot of what setbacks look like, and then what God sometimes is setting up for us through those setbacks. And so our scripture lesson, we're going to be looking at some select passages from Genesis in the story of Joseph. But let's just start with setback number one. And I'm going to give you the three setbacks kind of quickly so that we can then talk about them a little bit interchangeably. The first setback was that he was abandoned. or marginalized, I really should say. He was abandoned. Genesis 37:28 says, so when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, if we just read that part of the story, that's bad enough as it is. But the truth is that their intent in putting him in the cistern was to kill him. They were going to kill him. Now, the oldest brother had spoken up and said, instead of killing him right now, why don't we, put him here? And so, but these guys wanted to kill him. They wanted to kill their own brother. And actually, whenever they decided, instead of killing him, they'd just make a little money off of him, they actually made it sound like it was a really good thing. Now, I'm not reading the whole passage. You can feel free to read this whole story yourself, but I don't have time to read all the passage, so I'm going to fill in the gaps a little bit and talk about it some as we go. But his brothers, one of them said, well, he is our flesh and blood. I mean, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him to be a slave. I mean, let's be nice brothers. Let's do something good for him and good for ourselves. So we don't want his blood. He's our brother. I mean, he's our blood and flesh. So we'll just sell him. Now, that was an improvement, but not a whole lot of an improvement. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if you're saying, you're going to kill me or sell me, you don't really necessarily know what the outcome of that is. And you're going like, well, hey, they turn nice all of a sudden. They're not going to kill him. They're just going to sell him. And so that's what happened. Now, here Joseph had already been marginalized by his brothers for many years. And you can say they had some reasons or some excuses. He did have that coat of many colors that his dad foolishly had made for him, just to go ahead and pronounce to everybody, hey, if you wanted to know who my favorite child is, just take notice of what he wears, And I'm going down here to Salvation Army and Goodwill and getting used clothes for all the rest of you. But this guy here, we're going to Fifth Avenue and we're going to do it right, And that's so there was some disparity there. And he was the younger brother, and he of course had a younger brother named Benjamin. But they were the favorites, and Joseph was by far the favorite. And his dad had no problem letting everybody know it. Every once in a while, when my kids come to me and say, like Hunter will say, Dad, why did you let Skylar do that? I will say, oh, you didn't know she's my favorite kid? Now, I say that to get the kind of reaction. He doesn't laugh, but he just moans or groans or like, whatever. But I say that to her too when she asks that kind of question. Well, you didn't know that Hunter's my favorite child, and so now we can joke like that, but you do have to be really, really careful not to convey that message truthfully, because there's something about kids already are, fighting for a position or a spot in that family line anyway. And I grew up in a family there were 5 of us kids, and that's, it's not a huge family, but it's a decent sized family. After my father passed away, my mom, I bought a Chevelle, a 1969 Chevy Chevelle that was 2-door. And she had a couple of younger sisters and a younger brother who were just a little bit older than we were, because she came from a family of 12. And so she was one of the older kids, and she had a couple, and they spent a good bit of time with our family. And so there would be times, there's like at least 6 or 7 of us kids in that car going someplace. Now, we even traveled. We lived in South Florida at the time. We traveled to Ohio in the summertime for a trip to see old friends and that kind of thing. And we'd be crammed in the car. And I mean, you're talking about, just and have luggage around, have stuff in the back window. I mean, you were just, we're sitting there on top of each other almost. So my first set of kids, my older kids, we decided at some point, we initially had a small car, and we decided, well, we need to get a minivan, So we got a minivan. And the back seat had captain's chairs in it. And so they had captain's chairs, and there was a blank seat behind them. And I'd be driving down the road, and you know what Jeff or Crystal would say? He touched me. She touched me. And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean they touched you? I made trips. I mean, I know they could quote this story, okay? I made trips all the way from Florida to Ohio And everybody was touching me. What do you mean, you know? We were all touching each other. We were sitting on each other's lap almost, you know, and making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches along the way, you know? It's like, what do you mean someone's touching you? So kids these days, they don't understand, do they? But the fact is, here's the point I'm making, and that is rivalry between siblings is real. And it's real today. It happens today. And it got very pronounced for a whole lot of family reasons in this family, Joseph's family. But when his dad made that coat, it was just, you know, this guy's hot dogging around, and it, you know, didn't make the others feel good. So they didn't like this guy at all. In fact, they developed a hatred for him, and enough so that they were willing to kill him. But there was another reason they didn't like him, and that was his dad would send him out to watch the sheep and everything, sometimes with him. And when they'd come back home, he would tell his dad, you know those brothers, those older brothers of mine? You're not going to believe what they did in that town. I mean, he'd tell his dad what they did. And it was all their bad actions and their bad behaviors and their sins that they'd committed and everything else. So dad would go have his talk with them. And so the older brothers are going, man, this kid's a snitch. He's a snitch. So they didn't like him at all. And in fact, it turned, like I said, to hatred, and now they're wanting to kill him. But they turned nice, and they just sold him as a slave. Real nice. So Joseph, being a young man, end of his teens at this time when this is happening, he finds himself in a situation where he was bought by a high officer in Egypt's army and a high official within the government of Egypt, which could have been a terrible thing or could have been a good thing. It turned out that he noticed, this guy that bought him noticed that Joseph was really good at everything he did. And not only was he really good, but he also, and the scripture says this, that he could see that God was with him. He knew it wasn't just Joseph being real smart and real organizational and a really good leader. He knew it was more than that. He could sense he had favor with God. And so he ended up putting him in charge of everything in his whole household. He was running the whole show. And so even though he was a slave, he was in charge. And he ran the whole household. Well, the Bible actually says this too, and you can read it for yourself, that Joseph was well-built and handsome. He was a very handsome young man, and he was well-proportioned. And they didn't even have Gold Gym or Evans Fitness Center or whatever back then, but he was fit. And so Potiphar's wife, his owner's wife, took a shine to him. And she started encouraging him to have a fling with her. And she would day after day after day, and he refused. Now, understand, probably he's at a peak of his physical being, his physical development. He's at a peak. So he's not like a blind, dumb, stupid guy. He has all the feelings any older teenager would feel or young adult would feel. He had all those feelings. But he had character. And his character said that this is a person that belongs to my owner, and this is off base for me. I cannot. And so he would tell her that. He would say, listen, you know, your husband has put me in charge of everything here, but he hasn't put me in charge of you. And he hasn't given you to me. And so, no. And then one day, no one else was around, and she grabbed his outer coat, and he ran right out of his coat and fled away from her. So she took that coat and then began to falsely accuse him and called the other servants around and said, hey, this guy tried to rape me and blah, blah, blah. And then when her husband came back, she told him, and he got angry. And this is the scripture we come to. So he was falsely, setback number 2, he was falsely accused. Here he was as a slave, had some things going pretty good for him. And here he gets this other setback, being falsely accused. He was betrayed. He was misjudged by his boss. Understandably so. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So I don't think this is one of those situations where there's a big trial or anything else. I think he's a slave. He's owned. He just stuck him in jail and just said, this is where all the people that work for the king and anybody else, that he stuck him in there. So here Joseph goes to prison, goes off to jail. For nothing that he had done wrong. Actually, he had done the right thing. It seems like, let me just ask you this question, and this can be in business dealings, it can be in all kinds of things. Have you ever really just worked hard at really making sure you're doing the right thing, and then you felt like you got punished for it almost? Like the way things went, it's almost like you got punished for telling the truth, or it almost like worked against you. Well, let me just tell you, certainly Joseph had to have had some of those feelings. That here he is, he's doing the right thing, he's resisting, he's far away from anybody he knew. It'd been an easy thing for him to have caved into this thing and gone along with this woman, and yet he stood his ground and he resisted, and he fled the situation. And the thank you he got was, go to prison. And there you are. So here Joseph, been abandoned by his brothers, been abandoned by everybody that he loved. And even though his father wouldn't have abandoned him, he still had to probably feel abandoned from him because he couldn't be around him. He was gone. Now he's owned. He's not a free agent anymore. He's owned. He belongs to somebody. And that's a certain kind of restriction in himself. But now that person has thrown him in prison for no good reason whatsoever other than a false accusation. Setback number 3 is he was forgotten. He was overlooked. While he was in jail, now something happened. It seems like everywhere he went, this happened. He got put ahead of the jail. He got put over the jail. The jailkeeper realized, man, this guy is trustworthy. This guy, he knows how to do things. He can handle it, and God's with him. And so he put him in charge of the whole jail. So Joseph's in charge of the jail. The guy can sit around and drink Kool-Aid all day and go home and didn't have to do much because Joseph took care of it all for him. So there were 2 guys in there from the king's court who both had dreams. Joseph said, well, God's the one who knows dreams, can interpret dreams. Tell me your dream. So the butler told him, the cupbearer told him his dream, and it was favorable. So the other guy said, I'll tell you my dream too. Well, his dream wasn't so favorable. He was going to be killed, and the interpretation of his dream. And so, sure enough, that guy got killed, and sure enough, the cupbearer got called back to work for the king again, just like Joseph had said. And the cupbearer had told him, Joseph had asked him, when you go back to the palace, would you please remember me? Would you remember me? And the scripture says, however, the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Forgot totally about him. Now, I want to ask you, don't raise your hand on this questions, okay? Have you ever felt abandoned in your life? It could be from a divorce. It could be from a death. It could be from a friend. It could be from a parent. We know all these things happen. And I think that everybody has a situation or two in life where they feel like somebody left them without good reason, or sent you away without really good reason. Maybe if you haven't felt abandoned, maybe you felt marginalized before, like you just were off on the peripheral, not totally let go, not sold into slavery, not totally rejected, just marginalized. Just you could only come in so close. You could only be so near up, just to in your family or with your friends or whatever. My father, I was with him in that car accident that ended up taking his life, and that night at the accident, he was conscious, even though in tremendous pain. And when I came to, we had conversation. He was having a hard time talking, because, and as we knew later, his ribs, many of his ribs were broken from hitting the steering wheel, and the steering wheel was actually broken too. And ultimately, what he died from was a severed aorta that had been ruptured at that point from the impact, and they did not find it. But the next morning, that's what he died from as he sat up, and died immediately from that. But that night, in the car while we were sitting there, my dad asked me, he had spoken at a church about an hour and a half away from our home, and I had gone with him, and he asked me he kind of felt me over and made sure I was able to move and everything, and asked if I would gather up his Bible in the back and his notes, and I did, and came back up in the front seat, and then he said, "I'm hurting really bad, Rod, would you pray?" And so I did say a prayer. I don't remember what I prayed, but I remember praying in that setting. And the next morning, I had slept on the sofa that night, and I remember whenever I began to hear a lot of disruption, and the ambulance came, and it began to become pretty apparent that Dad wasn't making it. And as a 10-year-old kid, of course, a lot of that was pretty overwhelming to me and beyond my capacity to fully comprehend everything. But I can remember over the next few years, I was there. I was in the accident. I was with my dad after the accident. I rode in the ambulance with him to the hospital. So I was at the hospital. They released him from the hospital. He actually even walked out of the hospital in great pain, but walked out of the hospital. And even that night, he'd called me back to the room where he was and talked to me a little bit before I went to sleep. Some relatives were starting to come and show up, and so I know what happened. I cognitively, I knew everything that happened. I was fully aware of it. But there were some times, maybe over the next few years, where I would have a thought go through my mind. What if Dad just walked off and left us? What if he's out in San Francisco someplace, or he's someplace in the world? I just feel, because all of a sudden I would just feel like he abandoned me. He abandoned me. Now I knew here he didn't abandon me, but emotionally sometimes I felt abandoned. I knew and could always bring it back to the point of going, Dad would have never left me. He would have never not been here for me through my growing-up years. He would have been there. He wanted to be there, but he wasn't able to be there. So sometimes, even in the loss of someone that we love and we know loves us, we sometimes still feel abandoned. And we have to walk our way through that and not live there, because then that would create damage that probably would be very hard to fix. But at the same time, to acknowledge or to admit that we have felt abandoned before, and whatever it is okay. It's okay. And it does happen to people. And it does happen to most people in some point, some place in their lives. And then, I hope that you've never been falsely accused. I hope that hasn't happened. But many people are falsely accused. And whenever you're falsely accused, it really hurts, because you know your intentions and you know what you did, and you know that was not what you did, or not what you meant, or not what. And when you're falsely accused, you feel kind of helpless, and you feel you feel like somebody that you thought knew you maybe really doesn't know you. And I think to be falsely accused by someone you don't even know doesn't hurt much, but if you're falsely accused by someone that you do know, halfway decent, that can really hurt pretty deeply. And so in this situation, I think Joseph understood this lady was covering for herself. She was mad at him, that kind of thing. But it still didn't feel good. In the little prestige he'd gotten, even as a slave, now it was all ripped from him. And he has, listen, if you've ever known somebody that's been in jail or been in prison, One of the things that's really, really hard on a lot of people there is that their family cuts them off. There's no communication. They don't put any money on their books. They don't put any money for them to make any phone calls or things like that. And so whenever people have that, it's a really big blessing. I know the phones weren't back there, but I'm just telling you, he did not have anybody that was going to come and visit him. His brothers didn't know whether he was dead or alive. His dad would believe he was dead, and everybody else in the family. And the brothers had no clue what had happened to him, what had become of him. And so here he is entirely alone in a foreign country as a slave and now as a prisoner. Looking like he might just die there. He might be in a situation where this is how his life ends. And so here, and it's one thing to be in prison and to know you deserve to be there. It's another thing to be in prison and know that you're innocent. To know absolutely you're innocent. And in this situation, he was absolutely innocent, but absolutely stuck. And then being forgotten and overlooked. Probably this is the most common thing that everybody has, just being overlooked. Maybe you feel like that on your job. They didn't notice that I show up every day, that I work really hard, that I do this, that I do that, the other, and that's the thank you I get. Overlooked. Sometimes you can be overlooked in your family. Nobody means to. It isn't anything necessarily against you, but just overlooked, forgotten. And the quieter you are, the less assuming you are, the more likely that is to happen. Some people are hard to forget because they make themselves so known. They're so present. They're out there. And I, sometimes I've even noticed this. If you have a kid, one of them is misbehaving, the other is behaving. The misbehaving child can kind of be, the misbehaving child will get all the attention. The behaving child sometimes will get ignored. Because they're not the problem. You got to focus on where the problem is. And so that happens sometimes in the family dynamics. It is unfortunately extremely common for people to forget even favors that have been done or blessings. And I don't think any of us do things for what we're going to get back for it, except maybe a business kind of deal, that kind of thing. You're making an investment. You're thinking in terms of return, but you're not thinking in terms of doing something for a friend or a family member and what am I going to get back out of it? And or at least hopefully not much in that way. But you're giving it from your heart. You're doing it from your heart, and it means that. But at the same time, it is not a joyful experience to be forgotten and overlooked for the good that we have done. And Joseph interpreted this dream for this guy. The dream came true. I don't know what the guy was probably thinking. Now I got to go see my kids. I got to go home to my wife. I got to do this. I got to do that. I got my income coming back in. I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, just totally just forgetting all about it. Didn't think to say a good word. Of course, still a dream came up. The king was all bothered and worried about. Since he was the cupbearer, he's right there with the king a whole lot. So he did get a chance then to eventually speak about it. And that was when a turnaround happened. But here's a couple things that I want to notice about what I believe Joseph did in processing these setbacks. I think the first question I wanted to ask is, because sometimes I can read the story of Joseph and I think, man, this guy is like a lot like Jesus. And I know there's sort of a parallel to his life and the life of Jesus. It's sort of a foreshadow of a Savior coming, how he lived his life. There's no question that's there. But I'm just talking about the character that he had, the decisions that he made, the way he seemed to handle himself in temptation, things like that. This guy was like, he's getting up there pretty high to close about as perfect of a man you'll read about in the Bible. Daniel's like one of the other guys that's kind of in that category where it just didn't seem like they messed up. A lot of people in the Bible and most of the people we know have this mess up history, this like, well, we ran on this track for this many years and then we kind of, eventually came to Christ but it's like these guys kind of, their lives sort of seem to be like on the right track. And Joseph's one of those. You think about the decisions he made and the character that he demonstrated in all the places, the ethic that he had, the work ethic he had, the way he rose to the top in every situation and did everything he did with excellence. And so I'm kind of thinking, I mean, was he bothered by what happened? You know, as he's bumping along on that caravan with these, you know, guys taking him as a slave, is he just sitting there thinking, well, God's got this. I mean, at least I'm alive. Was he so optimistic in his outlook that he could be happy riding down the road as a slave, not knowing what his future is? When he got sold to Potiphar, and he knows as a slave, this guy owns him. He doesn't work for him. He owns him, literally owns him. He can do anything he wants to do with him. Is he going, you know, it's kind of what I always dreamed of, was having a real secure job. You know, I feel very secure here. I feel like I'm probably not going to lose this job. You know, what was he feeling? What was going through his mind in all of this? And then when he's falsely accused and thrown in jail, you know, it seems like he must have been pretty positive there. So what is he just going like, well, you know, I guess it could be worse. I could have been killed out there in that field by my brothers. They were going to kill me. Hey, at least I'm alive, and I'm you know, and they're bringing me food once a day or something. I don't know. So what was he thinking? Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't know everything, but I think we have a little bit of a hint of the fact that his emotion, he did feel the things that we feel, and he did experience a lot of the things that we would have experienced because of two things. Number one, when his brothers were in front of him and he revealed who he was to them, do you remember? He had asked all of the Egyptians to leave. Do you remember what he did? Cried. And he cried so loud that even people in far areas could hear him. You're talking about an unbelievable release of emotion in that moment. Unbelievable. That he would cry to the extent that people at long distances were able to hear him. He was bawling. Did he have feelings? Did he have emotions about all this? Did he feel a lot of things all the way through? You better believe he did. You better believe he did. But it appears as though all of those emotions that he felt about being abandoned, about being falsely accused, about being forgotten, that he didn't allow his emotions to control him. He felt he had to feel all those emotions. He would never have cried like that. He had to have missed his dad, missed his brothers. He had to have missed his family. He had to have been in a situation where sometimes he maybe thought he wasn't going to make it into the next day. But instead of letting his emotions control him, he kept control of his emotions. Now, he lost it emotionally when his brothers were in front of him. That he had felt all this time got released, and it was huge. But there's one other thing that I think is a big, big hint on how he handled this stuff too. When his father died, his brothers came to him because you know what they were afraid of? They thought, he's been nice to us. He's taken good care of us. He's looked after us. But you know what? He and Dad, they were like that. Those guys were like that. They were close, buddy. So he knew Dad had been hurt. He knew he'd been hurt bad by what we did, everything else. Now Dad's dead. Watch what he'll do now. Let's see what he'll do now. And in that conversation, Joseph did two things very well. One of the best examples in the Bible of this. He said to them, he didn't let them off the hook. He didn't say, guys, you always were good big brothers. You loved me. I know you just had a bad day, didn't you, brothers? And he didn't say that. He said, you meant it for evil. You wanted to do me in, and you wanted to knock me out, and you wanted to get rid of me. But I learned something else in this process. You did mean it for evil, but I found out that God used it for good. He used it for good. Now, here's what I want to tell you. Bad things, we live in a world where bad things happen to us, where abandonment does happen, where marginalization does occur, where false accusations can fly, where we are often forgotten and overlooked. But I want to tell you, the best way to survive that is to forgive those who have done it to you. See, I believe that Joseph chose. He wasn't just a good guy. He chose to forgive his brothers. He chose to try to understand, what is God doing that I cannot see right now? That when this makes no sense to me, I believe God's up to something that I can't see. So I believe he was in touch with his emotions. He knew how he felt. And he probably did have some times when he had cried into his pillow at night when no one else was around about all the loss and all the tragedy that he'd experienced in his life. But he also, in the midst of that, chose to forgive his brothers. Not to give them a free ride, but to forgive him, not to hold it against him where he was going to do something to get exact revenge himself. Was he in a position to do it? Yes, and they knew it, and they came to him going, whatever it is you're going to do to us, we need to get this clear up right here. We need to go ahead and get it on the map, you know. And Joseph let them know that he had forgiven them, even though they did mean it for evil. He did not give them a free ticket. He did say, you guys were bad. That was evil. But guess what? You're not the ones I serve. God is the one I serve. And he brought good from this. He meant it for good. And that's what I'm going to choose to focus on. So he forgave. Forgiveness is huge whenever we've had setbacks in life. Because the first and foremost thing we want to do is blame everybody else for our problems. And ultimately, that generally makes us worse off than better off. But I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying I think it's good. Here's a couple other things that I believe, an observation of this story that I believe helped Joseph in this journey, in these setbacks. It appears to me that he leaned into God. Whenever everyone else forsook him, that he leaned into God. He didn't just say, well, I'm all by myself, I'm all alone. He leaned into God. And he didn't believe that God had forsaken him. He did believe his brothers had forsaken him. He did believe his brothers had sold him. But he didn't believe God had sold him. He didn't believe God had given up on him. He didn't believe God had given away. And so here's what I want you to remember this, and that is, if people let you down, people aren't God. God may have allowed people to let you down, but God doesn't let you down. He does allow people to let you down, but he doesn't let you down. And so he didn't believe God had forsaken him. He did not believe God was falsely accusing him. He did not believe that God had forgotten about him. He didn't believe that. He chose to believe that God loved him and God cared about him and God was not against him. He trusted God when he could trust nothing else. And let me say, could I say this? And I don't know for sure if you want to write it down, but I want to remember this. And that is this. When God is all we have, it's enough. It is enough. Now, we're human beings, and we love friendship and companionship and all that other. So whenever we feel like the closest people to it, I mean, his brothers that he worked with, he lived with, they were his family, and they rejected him. The person he worked hard to make Potiphar's house this great place, His wife turned against him, so Potiphar turns against him, throws him in jail. The guy he helped in jail, who said, oh, yeah, I'll remember you when I get back there. Thanks for interpreting that dream. That's awesome, man. I will remember you. He forgot him. When everyone around him didn't do the right thing and left him in lurches, one of the things that Joseph said, I had to say, you have to look at his life, you have to believe this, that he said, you know what? That didn't work out. Those people didn't care. This didn't happen. That happened, and that was bad, and this is other. But you know what? God is with me. And I'm going to tell you, we're human beings, and we like the friendship, the fellowship, the family, all the other, and I hope that always works for you. But the fact is that whatever is stripped away from us in this life, if we have God, He's enough. Doesn't mean we won't have other things. Joseph ended up having other things, but he is enough. Now, let's close with this setup. What kind of a setup? And let me just say this, that whenever he gets to this place, I don't believe, God doesn't bring bad things into evil into our life. He allows evil to happen. He allows bad things to happen. And he's always working redemptively. So in this situation, God could have gone about putting Joseph in this place in many different ways. But this is what happened. And I just want to tell you, you can't really circumvent God's purposes. And especially with someone who's following after his purposes. And so here's what happens. All these setbacks happen. All these setbacks happen. But remember, in the midst of that, Joseph chose forgiveness. He chose, I think, to be honest with his own emotions about this. He chose to lean into God. He chose to believe that God had not forsaken them. And he chose to trust God, even though it didn't look like it was working out, that God wasn't rewarding him for all that trust. Even though it looked like he wasn't being rewarded for it at all, he still chose to trust him. One of the things that got proven through that was that Joseph was trustworthy. He was a trustworthy person. And that trustworthiness, finally, they rubbed on him hard enough, long enough. I guess the word trustworthy showed up. He kept getting sanded on and sanded on and sanded on. Finally, it's like, oh my goodness, look, underneath there. This guy that's been through all this, trustworthy. Trustworthy. Look at Genesis 41, verse 37 to 40. It says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God? Just think about what that statement is. This is a secular, not a God-honoring person who the God of the Bible is far removed from his mind. He's a pagan leader. He's a dictator. He's to say and do whatever he wants to say and do when it happens. And he's saying, can we find anybody like this guy in whom is the Spirit of God? The Spirit of God. How many times have people said that about you? I know, I understand, Joseph's unique situation. He interpreted this great dream. But I'm just telling you, this pagan king saw something more than just a man here. He saw God at work in a man. He saw there was something greater than just Joseph going on. And if you notice, Potiphar saw that, the guard saw that, everybody who had contact with him saw that God was with this guy. He wasn't just Joseph. It wasn't just him being a good guy. It was that God was with him. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, see, Joseph didn't go, let me tell you your dream, buddy. I'll tell you. He didn't take all the credit himself. He didn't say, I'm really good at this. I'll just tell you right now, this is something you right down my alley. This is my sweet spot right here. No, he talks about how this is God's stuff. Only God can do this, and only God can. And so the Pharaoh, he's looking at it and he's going, yeah, he's a sharp guy. I understand why Potiphar's wife went after him and all that stuff. He's really cool looking and all that. But I'm going to tell you, what I'm impressed with is this God thing in him. There's something different about this guy, and it's that God thing in him. Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Sounds like to me Pharaoh's going, hey, Joseph, I'm about ready to go on an early retirement bench here, but I'm going to keep the keys in my hand, okay? So there's certain things you need to call me to get the keys for. But outside of that, I'll be out there on the back nine, I'm going to be out there doing this. I'm going to be out. But but the trust factor. Why did he trust him so much? Why did he entrust him with so much? Because he saw that he was a man who believed and honored God. And I want to tell you this. Most of us aren't going to be made the head of state. But what I would say is this. God's going to show favor through your faithfulness. Your faithfulness through abandonment. Your faithfulness through marginalization. Your faithfulness through being falsely accused or misunderstood or maligned or misjudged or betrayed. Or when you're just flat out forgotten. Kind of the subtle side of this. The passive side of this. No one seemed to notice the good you did. And even when you did good, it seemed to just get overlooked. Overlooked. I want to tell you, there is one who does not overlook. There is one who does not falsely accuse. And there is one who does not abandon. And his name is Jesus. He is with you. He will be with you. And he will bring you through.